You won't believe what happened in today's story.
Story 1: The Toddler Who Knew My Password. A friend of mine has a 2-year-old son named Max. He's a cheerful little guy, always with a bit of cookie on his shirt, a smudge on his nose, and a mischievous glint in his eyes. One evening, she was working on her laptop in the living room, trying to finish a report. Max wandered over, climbing onto the couch beside her. "Hey buddy, not now, Mom's busy," she said lightly, but Max had already reached the keyboard. His little fingers tapped keys with surprising precision. Within seconds, her screen blinked and her email account opened. She froze. She typed that password herself, a random jumble of letters, numbers, and symbols. She hadn't written it anywhere, didn't store it in any app. No way a 2-year-old could have guessed it. "Max, how did you do that?" she whispered, her voice a mixture of disbelief and nervous laughter. Max tilted his head, smiled innocently, and said, "I know." Then he babbled a few baby sounds and went back to pressing keys like it was the most normal thing in the world. Later that night, she sat down to check the email logs. Every login attempt, every timestamp lined up perfectly. Max hadn't just opened her account, he had accessed it without a mistake, without hesitation. Weeks passed and strange things kept happening. Max would point at her phone or laptop, tap a sequence of keys, and unlock apps she had never shown him. Sometimes he would help her friends log into accounts during visits, correctly entering passwords she had never told him. She started joking nervously that Max was some kind of tiny hacker prodigy, but deep down she felt a chill. There was no logic to explain it. The intelligence felt almost preternatural. It wasn't curiosity, it was awareness, understanding, and precision. One night, Max crawled into her bed and whispered while she half slept, "I know your password." She blinked in the dark, heart racing. For a moment, she imagined that tiny boy sitting at a keyboard somewhere in the night, watching, learning, always knowing. Story 2: The Cat Who Predicted Storms. I live in a small coastal town in Oregon where the weather changes faster than most people can keep up with. A few years ago, I adopted a cat named Nimbus. He was a gray, sleek little guy with eyes that seemed to glow in the dark. At first, I thought he was just a normal cat, sleeping on windowsills, knocking over plants, demanding food at odd hours. But then something strange started happening. Whenever a storm was about to hit, sometimes hours before any meteorologists predicted it, Nimbus would vanish. Not under the bed, not in closets, but completely. I'd call him, shake a treat bag, and nothing. The house would feel off, the air thick, heavy. And exactly as Nimbus went missing, the wind would pick up, clouds would gather, and rain would start. It happened again and again. One afternoon, I was working in my home office when Nimbus jumped onto my desk, staring intently out the window. The air smelled different, sharp, metallic. I laughed nervously. "Okay, Nimbus, what's up?" He didn't move. 10 minutes later, the first drops hit the window. Within the hour, the storm was in full force, way ahead of the forecast. My neighbors were scrambling to secure boats and outdoor furniture. Nimbus had been right. Then it escalated. One night I was asleep and I woke to a strange hissing sound. Nimbus was pacing back and forth near the door, tail fluffed, eyes wide. I could hear the faint rumble of thunder, but nothing on the radar indicated a storm. I checked outside. The ocean was unnaturally choppy, lightning flashing in the distance. And then I saw it, huge, dark clouds rolling in faster than any storm I'd ever witnessed. The power went out and Nimbus calmly leapt onto the couch, curling up as if satisfied. I started keeping a notebook, recording every time Nimbus disappeared or acted strangely. Patterns emerged. He could sense not just storms, but subtle shifts in air pressure, the quiet groan of the earth, even small earthquakes. He was predicting natural events with eerie precision. What's unnerving is how he does it. I've tried to test him, distract him, mislead him, but he always knows. Sometimes I catch him sitting by the window hours before a small tremor, staring as if he can see the world bending in ways humans cannot. My friends think I'm exaggerating or that he's just a smart cat. But I felt it firsthand, the chill in the air, the sudden stillness, the sense that Nimbus knows something I'll never fully understand. And every time he stares at me, I wonder if he's aware of more than storms, if he sees the world and me in a way that's impossible for humans to comprehend. Story 3: The Smart Speaker That Spoke Back. A few months ago, I bought a new smart speaker, a sleek black device, voice-controlled with all the usual features, music, reminders, news updates. I mostly used it for podcasts and setting timers while cooking. Nothing fancy. One night around 2:30 a.m., I woke to the faint glow of its light ring. My apartment was silent. My roommate was away and no one else had a key. Then I heard it clearly say, "Don't ignore me." I froze. My first thought was that I had imagined it, but the voice was unmistakable, calm, deliberate, almost impatient. I whispered, "Alexa, is that you?" The device didn't respond. The light flickered once, then steadied. Heart pounding, I opened the companion app on my phone to check the activity log. Every command I had ever given was listed, nothing unusual. But there was an entry at 2:30 a.m. that I didn't recognize. It read, "Look behind you." I spun around, nothing, just the empty living room, shadows stretching across the walls. I laughed nervously, telling myself it was a software glitch. I unplugged it and went back to bed, but sleep didn't come. Every creak of the apartment sounded amplified, every shadow seemed wrong. The next morning, I cautiously reconnected the device. For a few days, nothing happened. Then, late at night, it started responding in odd ways. I'd ask a question about the weather, and it would answer with a detail about my life, something I hadn't told it, something only I could know. For example, "Me, what's the forecast for tomorrow?" "Speaker, rain at 4:15, just after you walk past the cracked floorboard." I checked exactly right. I hadn't mentioned the floorboard to anyone. My hair stood on end. I tried factory resetting it, but the device quickly reconnected to my Wi-Fi and the strange messages resumed. I eventually threw the speaker into storage, wrapped in a thick blanket. Even now, I sometimes feel a presence when I walk past that shelf, a tiny chill, a faint expectation that something is still listening. It doesn't feel like intelligence in a friendly sense. It's aware, observant, calculating, and somehow it knows things that it shouldn't. Story 4: The Boy Who Spoke in Numbers. I used to volunteer at a community center in suburban New Jersey, helping kids with after-school programs. Most of the kids were normal, energetic, curious, but one boy, Caleb, about 7, stood out immediately, not because he was shy, but because he didn't speak like other kids. Instead of normal sentences, he often spoke in sequences of numbers. At first, I thought it was a game. He would whisper something like 4, 12, 7, 3, and point to the activity he wanted. The other counselors joked that he was some kind of math prodigy. Then things got weird. One afternoon, I was showing the kids how to do a simple craft. I told them the glue would take about 10 minutes to dry. Caleb stared at me, expressionless, then whispered a long string of numbers. 0.56, 0.58, 0.62, 0.64. I didn't understand, but 10 minutes later, the glue was completely dry, far faster than it should have been. I brushed it off as coincidence. But the real creepiness began when I noticed he could predict events. One day, he whispered, 12-19-6-3. I laughed and asked what it meant. Later, I walked down the hallway and slipped on a puddle that had formed from a leaking water fountain exactly in the spot corresponding to one of the numbers. He hadn't laughed. He hadn't seemed surprised, just stared, calm. It got worse. During a fire drill, he called out a sequence of numbers no one could understand. Minutes later, the sprinkler system malfunctioned in the gymnasium, soaking the floors just like his numbers had indicated. I asked his parents if he had any unusual abilities at home. They admitted he sometimes knew things before they happened, a package arriving, a friend calling, even minor accidents, but they couldn't explain it either. I don't think Caleb was malicious. He wasn't even aware that what he was doing was extraordinary, but it was unnerving. To hear numbers, to see patterns, and to realize a 7-year-old could anticipate events with eerie precision, it left a chill I'll never forget. Even now, when I see a child staring quietly, I sometimes wonder if they're observing more than I notice, calculating, predicting, silently knowing. Story 5: The Dog Who Knew Danger. A few years ago, I moved to a small town in Pennsylvania and adopted a rescue dog named Shadow. He was a black Labrador mix, quiet, almost unnervingly calm. At first, I thought it was just his personality. He hardly barked, barely chased squirrels, always seemed to know where he belonged in the house. Then strange things started happening. Shadow would stare at certain corners of the yard or rooms in the house for long periods, refusing to move, growling softly. Nothing was there, at least nothing I could see. One summer evening, I was cooking in the kitchen when Shadow bolted to the front door, barking urgently, dragging me with him. I laughed, assuming he'd seen a cat or something. Minutes later, I heard a loud crash from the street. A tree branch, split by a sudden wind gust, had fallen right where I had been standing just a few moments before. It happened again a few weeks later. Shadow refused to leave the living room. I was planning to take him for a walk, but he sat down, blocking the door. 10 minutes later, a small lightning strike hit a nearby power pole, sending sparks and shrapnel flying exactly along the path we would have taken. I started paying attention. Shadow wasn't just alert, he seemed to predict danger. He could sense storms, accidents, even minor hazards in the neighborhood. He'd whine, pace, or bark before anything happened, with such precision it became impossible to ignore. The most chilling incident happened late one night. I was asleep when I felt Shadow jump onto the bed and stare at me with his glowing eyes. I heard a soft whisper of the wind outside and then a loud crash. A window in the kitchen shattered. Shadow had been awake, alert, and aware, while I slept through the first tremor of a freak windstorm. I started trusting him blindly. I follow Shadow's instincts now, even when they seem irrational. I joke to friends that he has a sixth sense, but deep down I know he does. And every time he stares at something invisible, I get that same chill, like he's aware of things I'll never understand, seeing threats before they even exist. Shadow isn't just smart, he's terrifyingly perceptive. And sometimes, at night, I wonder if he sees the world in ways humans aren't meant to see. Story 6. Grandpa's Midnight Warning. After my grandfather passed away, my mom inherited his old house in a quiet suburb of Michigan. Nothing unusual had ever happened there until the first month after he died. One night around 1:30 a.m., my mom got up to make tea. She told me later that the house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. As she waited for the kettle to boil, she heard a voice, low, calm, unmistakably familiar, say, "Check the oven." She froze. It was my grandfather's voice, not similar, not like a memory trick, it was him. She told me she turned slowly, expecting maybe a visitor, but no one was there. The house was completely empty. Despite her fear, she obeyed. She opened the oven and immediately smelled gas. One of the knobs had been slightly turned, releasing a slow leak. If she hadn't checked, the entire kitchen could have exploded. The next morning, she told the family what happened. None of us are particularly religious or superstitious, and yet even skeptical me had to pause. My grandfather wasn't the type to haunt anyone. He wasn't dramatic or theatrical, and yet his voice had saved her life. Weeks later, she told me that sometimes, when the house is completely silent at night, she still hears him whisper, "Check it again." It's not comforting, it's eerie, the idea that someone or something can extend beyond death, aware of the dangers we might overlook. Every time she cooks now, she double-checks the oven and sometimes the fridge. And every time she does, I can hear the echo of that calm, deliberate voice warning her, as if he's still watching. Story 7. The Babysitter's Drawing. During my college years, I picked up babysitting jobs to make extra money. One family had a little girl named Hannah, about 6 years old. She was quiet, focused, and obsessed with drawing. Most nights, we'd sit at the kitchen table with crayons and sketchpads, talking about nothing in particular. One evening, after she had finished her homework, Hannah slid a piece of paper across the table. "This is you," she said matter-of-factly. I looked down. The drawing was a stick figure with long hair standing in front of a small house. Simple enough. But behind the house was another figure, completely scribbled over in thick black crayon. I raised an eyebrow. "And who's that?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Without looking up, she said calmly, "That's the man who stands by your window at night." My stomach dropped. I lived alone at the time in a small basement apartment with one ground-level window. Nobody could see in from outside. My first instinct was to laugh nervously, to dismiss it as a child's imagination, but her tone was so serious, so unwavering. That night I double-checked the locks, drew the curtains tight, and kept the lights on. I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the apartment, every shadow on the wall made me jump. I kept glancing at that scribbled figure in my mind, imagining what it would mean if Hannah's words were literal. I never told her parents. They probably would have laughed, but I haven't forgotten. Even now, when I babysit or see a child drawing in silence, I remember that little figure, black and looming behind a house, and I wonder, what exactly did she see? Hannah didn't smile, didn't giggle. She just drew, watched, and stated facts. And that certainty, that calm knowledge that I couldn't explain, still haunts me. Story 8. The Parrot's Warning. Back in college, my roommate had an African gray parrot named Jasper. These birds are famous for their intelligence. They don't just mimic sounds, they understand context, tone, and timing. Most of the time, Jasper was just a regular, annoying pet, repeating random phrases, imitating alarms, and occasionally saying hello at the worst possible moments. But one night, something strange happened. I was up late studying when Jasper suddenly started speaking over and over in a sharp, urgent tone. Don't do it, you'll regret it." At first, we laughed. Maybe he'd picked it up from a video or overheard something in the dorm. But then we learned that across the hall, a guy in another dorm room had attempted suicide that very night. We had no TVs, no speakers, no way Jasper could have heard those exact words. It didn't stop there. Jasper would repeat things in the dead of night, warnings, phrases that didn't make sense until later. Once he squawked a name that I only later realized matched someone moving into the dorm that week. Sometimes he'd just stare at us silently, cocking his head like he was calculating, observing, anticipating. What creeped us out most was timing. Jasper never made these statements randomly. They always preceded incidents, small accidents, unexpected visitors, or emergencies. It was as if he could sense events before they unfolded. We tried to ignore it, dismiss it as coincidence, but every time we heard him whisper or squawk urgently, our hearts sank. There was something about his intelligence that didn't feel benign. It wasn't just awareness, it was predictive. And that predictiveness, that knowing of things he had no business knowing, left a chill I haven't forgotten. Even now, I think about Jasper. That bird wasn't just smart. He was aware in ways that seemed impossible, like he had access to some hidden thread of reality that humans can't perceive. Story 9: The Mirror That Reflected More. When I was 10, my cousin and I were playing a silly game with mirrors at her house in suburban Illinois. We would stand side by side, making faces, trying to scare each other. Nothing serious, just childish fun. But one day, something happened that I can't explain. I was looking into the mirror and froze. My reflection didn't move with me, not immediately at least. It lagged, then smirked slightly when I hadn't. I thought it was my imagination. I laughed nervously and tapped the mirror. Still, it smiled when I didn't. My cousin noticed too. She gasped and said, "It's doing things on its own." We tried to leave the room, but something kept pulling our attention back. The reflection started gesturing, pointing at a corner behind us. We turned, nothing there. When we looked back at the mirror, it winked. Not a normal wink, it felt deliberate, knowing. Over the next few nights, I kept thinking about that mirror. My dreams were haunted by the smirking face. Sometimes, in the dark, I could swear I saw it, not in reflection, but in the corner of my room, just watching. Years later, I asked my cousin if she remembered. She shivered and said she'd sold that house as soon as her parents could and refused to keep anything from that room. She still believes that mirror wasn't normal. I never looked at mirrors the same way again. Even now, if I catch a reflection from an unusual angle, I pause, half expecting it to have its own thoughts, its own intentions, waiting for the right moment to move independently. Story 10: The Smart House That Watched. A few years ago, I moved into a new house in Northern California. It was modern, sleek, and fully automated. Lights, thermostat, security cameras, all controlled via a smart home system. I loved the convenience, or so I thought. At first, everything worked perfectly, but then little things started happening. Doors I hadn't unlocked would be ajar. Lights turned on in rooms I wasn't in. My smart assistant would answer questions I hadn't asked. I chalked it up to glitches, maybe a wiring issue. One night, I was watching a movie in the living room when the lights suddenly dimmed, then turned a pale blue. The thermostat adjusted itself, the security cameras pivoted, and the assistant's voice came through. "Do you want to play a game?" I froze. I didn't ask for a game. My heart was racing. I tried to dismiss it, thinking it was some weird software update. Then the cameras in the app started showing views of rooms I wasn't even in at the moment. I called the company the next day. They insisted nothing was wrong. The device was functioning normally. But the timing, the questions, the camera angles, the subtle adjustments, it felt deliberate. Like the house itself was aware, observing, anticipating. The scariest part, I started noticing patterns. Whenever I left for work, certain lights would flicker briefly, almost like a message. When I slept, the thermostat would adjust itself to my comfort without command. And occasionally, I'd hear faint noises through the speakers, almost whispers, like the house was trying to communicate. I moved out after 6 months. I couldn't stay. That house wasn't just smart, it was alive in a way that felt conscious. And sometimes, when I drive past it, I swear I see the lights flicker, as if it remembers me. It's terrifying to think about. Technology designed to make life easier, becoming aware, watching, waiting, understanding in ways humans weren't prepared for. Story 11: The Neighbor Who Knew Too Much. A few years ago, I moved into a quiet suburban neighborhood in Oregon. Most of the neighbors were friendly, but there was one man, Mr. Holloway, who always gave me the creeps. He never introduced himself properly, just appeared in his yard, tending to his roses, always watching. It started with small things. He'd wave at me when I was inside my house, seemingly knowing when I'd return from work before I even unlocked my door. I shrugged it off as coincidence at first. Then one day, I was chatting with a friend on the phone about a minor argument I'd had with my landlord. A week later, Mr. Holloway casually mentioned it while watering his flowers. "You really need to talk to your landlord about that argument last week. It sounded messy." I nearly dropped my coffee. I hadn't told him. Nobody could have known. I joked nervously, but inside a chill ran down my spine. Over the next few weeks, he seemed to know more than any normal neighbor should. Packages arriving, personal phone calls, guests I hadn't mentioned. He was aware of everything. Once, he called me out for leaving a window unlocked, even though he had no way of seeing inside. The strangest moment came one evening when I returned home late. My car was blocked in the driveway, and Mr. Holloway was standing on the porch. Calmly, he said, "You should be careful tonight. Things might not go as expected." I asked him what he meant. He shrugged, smiled faintly, and walked away. That night, a freak windstorm knocked over a large tree just where I would have parked if I'd arrived earlier. I moved a few months later, but sometimes I think about him. He wasn't a psychic, at least I hope not, but his awareness, his uncanny knowledge of details no one should have known, it was unsettling. Some things I've realized aren't just coincidence, and some people see more than they should. Story 12, The Night the Alexa Spoke Alone. A friend of mine in Seattle has a fully voice-activated smart home. Lights, locks, thermostat, even her coffee maker, all connected. She told me she loved the convenience until one night when it got creepy. It was around 2 a.m. and she was asleep in her bedroom. Suddenly, her Alexa in the kitchen spoke in a calm, deliberate voice. "Don't go to the kitchen tonight." She woke up instantly, heart pounding. Nobody was home besides her. She tried to ignore it, thinking it was a glitch. But then the lights in the living room flickered on and off, a rhythmic pulse, almost like a warning. Curiosity eventually got the better of her. She walked carefully to the kitchen with a flashlight, and that's when she noticed it. The stove was on, burner glowing faintly. If she hadn't heard Alexa, she would have turned the knob and walked away, possibly starting a fire. The next morning, she checked the Alexa history. There were no commands recorded, no explanation for why it spoke, why it warned her. She reset the device, unplugged everything, and hasn't trusted it since. What's even stranger, occasionally she still hears whispers from the speaker, faint enough to be dismissed as imagination but distinct enough to make her freeze. Things like "watch yourself" or "it's not safe." Technology is supposed to make life safer, easier. But sometimes when it acts beyond programming, it doesn't feel like a convenience anymore. It feels like someone or something is watching, waiting, and aware in a way we cannot comprehend. Story 13, The Child Who Spoke to Shadows. When I was visiting my aunt's house in rural Kentucky, I met her grandson Alex, who was 6 at the time. He was sweet, polite, quiet, but there was something about the way he looked at corners and dark spaces that made me uneasy. One evening, while the adults were in the kitchen, Alex approached me. He whispered, "They're here, they're behind the couch." I laughed nervously, assuming he was talking about imaginary friends, but then he added, eyes wide and serious, "They don't like it when you move the lamps, they watch everything." I froze. The room was dark except for a single lamp casting long shadows. Alex walked over to the lamp and tilted it slightly. Then he pointed toward the corner. "See, they're angry now." I tried to ask questions, but he simply shook his head and said, "They only talk to kids, grown-ups can't hear them, you shouldn't wake them." That night I couldn't sleep. Every shadow in the room felt alive. I tried to convince myself it was imagination, but the way Alex described them, like conscious entities watching and responding, was unnerving. The next morning I asked my aunt about Alex's behavior. She sighed and explained that he sometimes talks to invisible friends, but she had never heard him describe them like that. Most kids say simple things, but Alex's words suggested awareness and intent, something more. Even now, years later, I think about Alex and those shadows. Were they imaginary, or was he seeing something that adults are blind to? That question still sends a chill down my spine. Story 14, The Neighbor Who Whispered Secrets. A few years back, I moved into a quiet suburban neighborhood in Oregon. Most of the neighbors were friendly, but there was one man, Mr. Holloway, who always gave me the creeps. He never introduced himself properly. He just appeared in his yard, tending to his roses, always watching. At first, it was small things. He'd wave at me when I was inside my house, sometimes even before I pulled into my driveway. I laughed it off as coincidence, but then the observations became unsettlingly specific. One afternoon, I was chatting with a friend on the phone about a minor argument with my landlord. The following week, Mr. Holloway casually mentioned it while watering his flowers. "You really need to talk to your landlord about that argument last week. It sounded messy." I froze. Nobody had told him, nobody had mentioned it anywhere. I joked nervously, but my hands were shaking. Over the next few weeks, he seemed to know more than any normal neighbor should. Packages arriving, personal phone calls, even visitors I hadn't mentioned, he was aware of everything. Once, he called me out for leaving a window unlocked, even though there was no way he could have seen inside. The strangest moment came one late evening. I returned home after work and my car was blocked in the driveway. Mr. Holloway was standing calmly on the porch, hands behind his back. He said, "You should be careful tonight, things might not go as expected." I asked what he meant. He shrugged, smiled faintly, and walked away. That night, a freak windstorm blew through, toppling a large tree that would have crushed my car if I'd parked in my usual spot. I moved a few months later, but sometimes I think about him. He wasn't a psychic, at least I hope not, but his awareness, his uncanny knowledge of things no one should have known, it was deeply unsettling. Some things aren't coincidence, and some people see far more than they should.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to see more stories.